Hello everyone, welcome to Game 2 from the Karpov versus Kasparov saga 1985 World Chess Championship. Game 1 was won by Garry Kasparov and took a very early 1-0 lead in the race to 12 and a half out of 24 games. Karpov has the white pieces in this game, so he would be really hungry to equalize. And level the playing field. So yeah, let's see how it goes. Karpov starts with e4. Uh, Kasparov replies c5. So knight f3 and d6, d4. So we have a open Sicilian here. Kasparov is was not the kind of player who would back down from a fight and would go for an easy draw in any situation. And and Karpov was trying to equalize. So yeah, this is an invitation and acceptance of an open battle from both the players. C takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6. So we have a Najdorf, pretty theory heavy, and both sides would have chances, pretty sharp. And bishop e2, not the most sharp line, I would say. Bishop e3, bishop g5, queen d2, and long castles, and then g4, g5, g4, h4, going after the black king would have been much sharper. But Karpov opts for a much more calmer line, bishop e2, where he would have a slight advantage over black for a long period of time. That's the Karpovian style of playing. E6, not e5 here. So he's not he's letting this knight stay here, and but is satisfied with controlling all these central squares for himself. Castles, bishop e7 and f4. Long castles, king h1, queen to c7. So pretty bookish line here. Still no player has deviated from the book. This is the most played line and pretty heavily analyzed line. Maybe it was different back then, and it was new, but yeah, currently we don't have that information. uh, yeah, till now it looks pretty by the book. So a4, it stops basically b5, b4, and which kick the knight, and then strengthens this e4 square indirectly. Knight to c6 and bishop to e3. Rook e8, bishop to f3 now, and rook to b8. The most played line here is g4, which is telling the black side that okay, I'm going after queen king, and it's a pretty direct attack. Karpov opts for queen d2. So I would say this is where the opening has ended and the middle game has started, because the rooks are now connected, and this is the definition of where the middle game starts, right? So yeah, both player needs to come out with a plan. Queen to f2 now, and knight takes d4. So the idea behind queen f2 was it's a nice home for the queen, where it watches over, I mean, makes a battery in this line as well as makes a battery in this line if this bishop and this pawn were to move out. So indirectly it prepares for either a e5 break or a f5 break, and also it targets this b6 square, which looks like a hole currently, unless black pushes b6 himself. Right, so black takes this knight, and bishop takes d4, e5 now. So the plan is I mean for white to play e5 himself, and uh, I mean black has to take, then white takes, and then this bishop's eyes open, as well as if white takes here, the white pawn will be here, so that the knight has to move, and then this battery would be more effective against the f7 pawn. So that's the idea white is going to deploy, uh, which is why a very important move here, e5 by black himself. If white takes here, then black is going to take with his pawn, and his pawn is going to end up here, right? Then this bishop is not going to have let's see that line actually. If white takes and black takes, and bishop to e3. So this position Karpov was not a fan of, just for the fact that this knight will not be challenged, and this knight guards the d5 square, and if this bishop comes to e6 or probably c6, then this rook comes here, so this square is going to be heavily guarded as well. So yeah, I mean this is not what Karpov had in mind. His conclusion was black would be pretty decent here and would have no weakness. So backing up here, right? That's why instead of taking here, he opted to retreat the bishop, so that if black takes, and then he would take, and he would have a target at least on d6, as well as this file can be open, and he can push e5 at the right moment. Kasparov opts for bishop e6 and f5 by Karpov. So this bishop does not have too many good squares, right? I have some green arrows here, which signals that okay, the plan is to advance these pawns and not give black any space, and then mount a kingside attack with these rooks and this queen. But the immediate threat is on this e6 bishop, and it does not have a good retreat square, right? Doesn't have this square, doesn't has this square, and doesn't all these squares are taken. But if it comes to say this square, and but from here it does not have any safe square. I mean all these squares are in the enemy camps, and is taken. But Kasparov still opts for this bishop c4, where he threatens the rook. So immediately Karpov cannot play this b3 because he would end up taking the rook. So what he does is guards this pawn. The idea being that next move is b3, and then if bishop takes, then this pawn would take, and this knight is protected. That this queen cannot take this knight. So threatening now b3. So Kasparov sees this and replies with d5 himself. What's the idea? If b3, then he would target this knight himself. This is an intermezzo by Karpov, just pushing the queen back a square. White goes on with this plan b3. If white opts for e takes d5, this is not a great move by white, just because the queen can take here, and then this would weaken the e4 square by a lot. If say b3, then mostly e4, and then this pawn would if this bishop retreats, then this pawn would fall taken by the bishop. If you take, then black takes, and queen takes f3. So yeah, this is not the best version that white can end up with, and probably not the version that Karpov wants here. So b3 instead played by white in this position rather than takes, and bishop to b4, threatening this knight basically. Karpov plays knight to a2. The knight could have retreated to other squares like d1 or b1. If it goes to e2, then it would be taken up by this by the bishop at c4. But say it goes to d1, yeah, this is not very good for white, because simply because d takes e4 and this bishop has no real good place to go, right? And black has all the counterplay, and this and these pieces are really harmonious to say, and not placed on ideal squares. So instead Karpov opts for knight to a2 and bishop to a3 now, targeting this rook. So basically Kasparov wanted to give his two bishops for a rook and a pawn. So Karpov gladly takes it. B takes c4, bishop takes c1, knight takes c1, and queen takes c4. So so Karpov has two pieces, the mostly two bishops for a rook and a pawn. In the end game, this is definitely advantage white, but the compensation is black has a very active queen and good central pawns, and white has really poorly placed pieces that are not really harmonious or are not doing anything for him. So if white can make these pieces to work for him, then it's definitely a game on, and the two bishops would definitely dominate a rook and a pawn. So and Karpov now takes d5, and this and e4. This bishop has no real squares to retreat, right? Either e2 or d1. He in the game he chooses e2, but if he went to d1, then mostly e3, and yeah, this is not a I mean, this pawn is really too far in white's camp, and really will create some havoc. Say bishop takes e3, queen to c3, targeting this rook as well as this bishop, and one of them has to fall. You could say that, okay, bishop to d4, but then yeah, don't forget about this threat of rook to e1. So bishop to e2 now, and yeah, queen takes c2, and basically this pawn is going to race, and this queening square is protected by this bishop. So white has got some good threats down the road, but this pawn is also looks very dangerous. So there's going to be a race between the e pawn for white, for black, and d pawn for white. Queen to d4, supporting this pawn as well as placing the queen in a very good centralized square. Rook to c8, h3, making air for the king, so that there is no back rank mate happening. Now this Kasparov pushes e3, d6. Now white pushes his pawn, and queen to d2. So you can't really push d7 here, because the knight would take, and this queen indirectly protects this d7 square, and white cannot take on this square even, because if the pawn takes, then this knight is under attack, and this bishop, if this knight moves somewhere, this bishop would fall. So Karpov plays knight to d3, giving up this bishop, but next is d7, and he would collect the piece back. Queen takes e2, d7, knight takes d7, and queen takes d7, and now queen to d2. So now Kasparov makes way for his pawn to march down the board. Rook to e1 now by Karpov, just to make sure that this pawn does not threat. Does not threat, and there is no sacrifices happening on this d1 square when the pawn is on e2. But anyways, e2 by Kasparov. King to g1. His plan is to march to g2 and thereby cement this e1 along with rook. This knight protects the rook and queen protects the knight. So basically trying very hard for this pawn not to queen. Black's plan is pretty obvious here, right? He wants to kick this knight so that this rook is in danger. So how does he kick this knight? Put this rook on the c3 square and pressurize this knight. But he can't do that yet, just yet, because this queen is attacking this rook, and this rook and the c1 rook can't really leave the back rank. So Black's plan is simple: get this rook to safety, and then this rook to c3. However, Kasparov opts for a5, a different sort of plan, maybe, I guess, attacking from this side, maybe getting this rook to a8, then this rook here, and then coming here. Yeah, so or maybe attacking from this side of the board. Yeah, somehow he has to get these rooks active. They are occupying open files, but they have to protect each other just because this queen is in such a dangerous square, right? Then g3 by white. This is a blunder by Karpov. It was a decisive mistake. Kasparov could not take advantage of it, but yeah, I'll just try to find out how black should exploit it while I give you a couple of minutes. I hope you could find the way how black could win here, but if you didn't, just so it follows like this. It's the same plan that we discussed in the last move, getting this rook out, and the next is rook to c3, and you can't really protect this knight, and this knight has to move. Let's see a line here, right? What happens when the rook comes here? Say king to f2 anyway, and rook to c3. Now this knight has to be protected, but since this queen is pinned, so this is the only move that the knight can move, because the queen would fall otherwise. But then this very dangerous move, rook to f3. So that's the difference between if the pawn was on g2 versus g3. If the pawn was on g2, now he could take the rook with g takes f3. But since it's in g3 now, there are only two options. There are only three options now. One, the king has to move, the knight could take, or the king could take. That if the knight takes, then this queen falls. So that's not going to be good for white at all, right? So, and what happens if this king takes? Then queen takes e1, and then just getting queen f1, and then pushing the pawn, or just queen d1, then pinning the king and pushing the pawn. So there's no way to stop it now, actually. Say bishop to f2 is a line, but queen to d1, and if and basically the threat is to queen with check. So if black dodges it by king to g2, then basically queen to f1 check here, and then queening it anyway. This bishop can't take because this is pinned to the king. So yeah, this was a decisive mistake which Kasparov didn't see. Instead, he played queen to h6 here. This gave this gave Karpov a very good chance to escape, right? He comes right back with bishop to f2 and queen to c6. Yeah, so Karpov happily trades off the queen here. Queen takes c6 and rook takes c6. Now the game has simplified quite a bit after the queens are off. This e1 square is pretty protected pretty good, and this king would really march to f2, and this bishop comes to e1, and then this rook just gets out of the way. So black has some advantage, but maybe it's winning or not is difficult to tell here. So Karpov goes for rook e1, going after this pawn, and Kasparov goes for rook c4, going after the a4 pawn. Takes, and then bishop to e1. Rook to a3, going after the knight, and rook to d7, protecting it. A4, he pushes his pawns, and king to f2. Pretty logical moves, really. And rook to b3, making way for this pawn to really march, since this knight, this bishop are all tied up. But yeah, this knight to c1 now, attacking the rook, and rook to b1, and knight to a2. Kasparov plays here rook to a8, and the idea is if say white goes after this knight again, so knight to c3, attacking the pawn. If you play a3, then white would play rook to a7 himself. That would I mean, there's no way to really push this pawn now, since this rook is behind this pawn. So just to avoid that, Kasparov, instead of going after this knight, played rook to a8 himself, so that this rook cannot come in this line. But yeah, this leaves this e2 pawn, right? So Karpov goes after this pawn, and rook to b2, and rook takes e2, rook takes e2, and king takes e2. So just look at this structure. This knight is here, so this pawn can't move, but we can think that this rook can somehow invade the 7th rank and kick this knight out. But if you see closely, this is a kind of fortress-like position, and black cannot really penetrate it. How? If this rook tries to come by this line, this bishop guards the b4 square. It will just go and sit here. If this tries to come in this line, this bishop guards the c3 square, and it just go and sit there. This knight really does a very good job of holding these two squares, so that the bishop just goes and sits here, and this rook can't penetrate. It could come by the d square, but this king then provides the protection here, and does not allow him to come via this route. So yeah, I mean, don't be fooled by the engine bar evaluation here. Stockfish really shows minus 1.6. I'll just show you the engine. Yeah, so this Stockfish shows here minus 1.6, but this is not the real evaluation. This is a draw, and white can hold it actually. How I know it is, I played Stockfish against Stockfish in this position, and white Stockfish could hold this position. Right. But still, Kasparov tries to break through with rook to e8 check, king to f2, and h5 himself. Karpov goes bishop to c3, rook to b8, and bishop to b4, just not allowing this rook to enter at all. Rook to d8, and king to e2. So this square is taken up by the bishop, so this king needs to guard this d1 and d3 white squares. A3 by Kasparov. The bishop can't really take here, because if it takes, then rook here, and you lose one of these two pieces. So, king needs to king needs to be at least in the C file for this bishop to take, so that when the rook pins these two pieces, the king is in time to go to b3 square and protect the two pieces. Yeah. So bishop to c3 by Karpov, and f6 by Kasparov. And bishop to b4, he just there's nothing to do, just oscillate between c3 b4, and there's no way black can penetrate. King to f7, and then knight to c3. This knight is not really going anywhere. This is just going to c3, and it will easily come to a2, the next one. Rook to b8, and knight to a2. Rook to b5 now, targeting this pawn, trying to do something on this side of the board, but g4 protects it. And rook to b8, and king to d3. So the plan is to go to c4 and then silently collect this pawn. Rook to d8, and king to c4. Rook to d1. Finally the rook penetrates, but it's not going to be enough, given that these two pieces are going to be free, and it can easily stop at least two pawns from marching through. Bishop to a3, bishop takes a3, rook a1, king to b3. So Kasparov could have gone for rook to h1 directly, but does this intermezzo just to put this king one step far from this side of the board, and then goes to rook to h1. This is a nice technique. G takes h5, rook takes h3 check, and knight to c3. Rook to f3 now. Rook, this rook could have taken the h5 pawn, but yeah, knight to e4, and then you can't really take this because knight d6 check, and you then lose the rook, and these two pawns can be guarded by this bishop and this king easily. And also now I think this bishop would go here if this king leaves, and these two pawns are going to be hunted down. So rook to f3 by Kasparov, and bishop to c1. Rook takes f5 and h6, g6, and knight to e4. Rook to h5, and bishop to b2. And this is where they agreed for a draw. If you want to see how the draw would proceed, let's say f5 here, and h7. The rook has to take this because the h8 square is protected, and next white was planning to queen. So knight to f7, king to g8. Okay, this g7 square is protected. Sorry, my bad. Knight h7 and king h7. So, and probably bishop to c1, and then guarding all these squares, and this would have been an easy draw by easy position to hold by Karpov. So let's see a computer analysis now and see how many centipawn loss and inaccuracies by each side. So as you can see, white had advantage from the opening, and a slight advantage. It is not a winning or decisive advantage. Yeah, then there is this it went south from 27 this position. So basically, yeah, this is where black got the initiative, and black had most of the play, and yeah, here black was dominating, and this was definitely the blunder when white played this move g3. So yeah, and yeah, had advantage, but yeah, this part is mostly is not correct by the engine. It sometimes does a bad estimation for the end games that it cannot predict correctly. So 3 inaccuracies by Karpov, 1 mistaken, 1 blunder, 4 inaccuracies by Kasparov, and 1 blunder. 18 average centipound loss to 17 centipound loss. So after a pretty long battle in the game 2 ends in a draw. Kasparov still has the lead with 1.5 to 0.5. Uh, he is going to be playing the white pieces in game 3, and will definitely try to extend his lead to 2 point with white pieces. Let's see how game 3 is going to be.